Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places. Picture this: a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Detroit, where the smell of motor oil mingles with the sound of wrenches hitting concrete. It's here that Tom Sullivan, a 52-year-old mechanic with calloused hands and a heart bigger than his bank account, was about to make a discovery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, family, and destiny. What started as a simple act of kindness on a stormy October evening would unravel a mystery worth billions of dollars. A secret so profound, it would transform not just one life, but generations to come. But before we reveal how a stranger's broken-down car became the key to unlocking an empire, you need to understand that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the courage to look beyond the surface. This is the story of how helping others can lead to the most unexpected rewards, and why you should never underestimate the power of a generous heart. Tom Sullivan wiped his grease-stained hands on the old Detroit Lions t-shirt he'd been wearing for the past decade. The clock on the wall of Sullivan's auto repair showed 7:30 p.m., well past closing time, but Tom never was one to watch the clock too closely. His small shop sat on the corner of 8 Mile Road, sandwiched between a laundromat and a family-owned diner that had been serving the same meatloaf special since 1987. "Another day, another dollar," Tom muttered to himself, a phrase his father had repeated countless times while working in the same auto plants that had built Detroit's reputation. But unlike his father, Tom had chosen a different path. After 25 years working the line at Ford, he'd taken his pension and opened this modest repair shop, determined to be his own boss and serve his community. The shop wasn't much to look at from the outside. The paint was peeling, the sign needed replacing, and the parking lot had more potholes than a country road. But inside, Tom had created something special. Every tool had its place. Every part was organized with military precision, and every customer was treated like family. That's just who Tom was. A man who believed that character wasn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the size of your heart. Tom's wife, Maria, often joked that he'd give away his last dollar if someone needed it more than he did. She wasn't wrong. Over the years, Tom had fixed countless cars for single mothers who couldn't afford the full repair cost, helped elderly neighbors get their vehicles running for grocery trips, and even kept the local food delivery drivers on the road during the pandemic when every dollar counted. "You can't eat kindness," Maria would tease him, but her eyes always sparkled with pride when she said it. They'd been married for 28 years, raised 2 kids who'd gone on to college, and lived in the same modest house they'd bought as newlyweds. They weren't rich by society's standards, but they were wealthy in the ways that truly mattered. As Tom began closing up for the night, he heard the rumble of an engine struggling outside. Through the window, he could see an expensive black sedan with steam rising from under the hood, pulling slowly into his lot. The rain had started falling harder, creating rivers in the parking lot's potholes. A well-dressed man in his 60s stepped out of the driver's side, immediately getting soaked by the October downpour. From the passenger side emerged an elegant woman, probably his wife, trying to shield herself with a designer purse. In the back seat, Tom could make out the silhouettes of what appeared to be 2 children. Tom didn't hesitate. He grabbed his umbrella and jogged outside, his work boots splashing through puddles as he approached the stranded family. "Engine trouble?" Tom called out over the sound of rain hitting metal. The man looked up, relief washing over his weathered face. "Yes, it just started overheating about a mile back. We're trying to get to our hotel, but..." He gestured helplessly at the steam still rising from the hood. "Let me take a look," Tom said, already moving toward the front of the car. "Why don't you folks come inside where it's dry? I've got some coffee brewing and it's warm in there." The woman looked uncertain, glancing around the modest shop with obvious hesitation. Her designer clothes and jewelry suggested they weren't accustomed to places like this. But the rain was getting heavier and the children in the back seat were starting to get restless. "That's very kind of you," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert, this is my wife Catherine, and our grandchildren Sophie and Michael." "Tom Sullivan," he replied, shaking Robert's hand with a firm grip. "Let's get you folks inside, and then I'll see what we're dealing with under that hood." As they hurried toward the shop, Tom couldn't help but notice the contrast between this family and his usual customers. Their clothes probably cost more than most people in his neighborhood made in a month. The woman's watch caught the light from the shop window. Definitely not something you'd find at the local department store. Even the kids, who couldn't have been more than 10 and 12, carried themselves with a certain poise that spoke of private schools and summer camps. Inside the shop, Tom quickly cleared some chairs from his small office area, wiping them down with a clean rag. "Coffee's not fancy, but it's hot," he said, pouring steaming cups from the pot he kept brewing throughout the day. "And I think I've got some hot chocolate mix somewhere for the kids." Catherine finally smiled, the first genuine expression Tom had seen from her since they'd arrived. "You're very kind, Mr. Sullivan. We really appreciate this." As the family settled in, Tom excused himself to examine their car. Popping the hood, he immediately spotted the problem. A burst radiator hose, probably weakened by age and finally giving way under pressure. It wasn't a difficult fix, but it would take some time, and he'd need to wait for the engine to cool down completely before he could safely replace the hose. When he returned to the office, he found Robert helping young Michael with what appeared to be homework, while Sophie was showing Catherine pictures on her phone. They looked like any other family dealing with an unexpected bump in their travel plans, except for those subtle signs of wealth that Tom's trained eye had picked up. "Good news and bad news," Tom announced. "Good news is it's just a radiator hose, not expensive to fix. Bad news is I need to let that engine cool down completely before I can work on it safely. We're probably looking at a couple of hours." Robert's face fell. "A couple of hours? We were supposed to meet some people for dinner at 9. "I'm really sorry," Tom said, meaning it. "I could try to rush it, but I'd rather do it right than have you break down again 5 miles down the road." Catherine placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "It's okay, Robert. We can reschedule. This gentleman is doing us a favor." What happened next surprised Tom. Instead of calling for a taxi or rideshare, the family seemed content to wait it out in his modest office. Robert struck up a conversation about Detroit's automotive history, showing a knowledge that went deeper than casual interest. Catherine asked thoughtful questions about Tom's business, and the children, after finishing their homework, began exploring the shop with the curious eyes of kids who'd never seen the inside of a working garage. "Grandpa, look at all these tools," Sophie called out, marveling at Tom's collection of wrenches hanging neatly on the pegboard. "Can you really fix any car with these?" Michael asked, his eyes wide with genuine curiosity. Tom found himself giving an impromptu tour, explaining how different tools worked, letting the kids hold some of the lighter ones, and sharing stories about some of the more challenging repairs he'd tackled over the years. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and even their grandparents seemed genuinely interested in his explanations. As the evening wore on, something unexpected began to happen. The initial awkwardness melted away, replaced by easy conversation and genuine laughter. Robert shared stories about his own grandfather, who had worked in the auto plants during World War II. Catherine talked about her love of vintage cars, mentioning that she'd always wanted to learn basic maintenance but never found the time. "You know," Tom said, refilling coffee cups. "I offer basic maintenance classes sometimes. Nothing fancy, just oil changes, checking fluid levels, that sort of thing. A lot of folks find it empowering to know the basics." "I might actually take you up on that," Catherine said, and Tom could tell she meant it. By the time Tom was able to safely work on their car, it felt less like helping strangers and more like spending an evening with old friends. The repair itself took only about 20 minutes. Remove the old hose, install the new one, refill the radiator, and test the system. Simple work for someone with Tom's experience. But as he was finishing up, something caught his eye. While cleaning around the engine bay, he'd noticed the vehicle identification number etched into the frame. It was a detail most people would never pay attention to, but Tom had been working on cars long enough to recognize patterns. This particular VIN sequence was unusual, not just because of the numbers, but because of where it was manufactured and when. He'd seen this exact VIN format only once before, years ago when he'd worked on a prototype vehicle at Ford. These weren't regular production cars. They were custom builds, the kind made in extremely limited quantities for very specific purposes, the kind of vehicles that cost more than most people's houses. Tom tried to push the thought away. Lots of wealthy people drove expensive cars. That wasn't unusual, but something about the combination of details was nagging at him. The VIN, the quality of the interior materials he'd glimpsed, Even the way certain components under the hood were arranged, it all pointed to something far more exclusive than he'd initially realized. When he returned to the office to let them know the repair was complete, Tom found Robert studying an old photograph on the wall. It was a picture from Tom's Ford days, a group shot of the team that had worked on a special project in the late 1990s. Tom was in the front row, much younger, wearing the same proud smile he'd worn the day they'd completed their assignment. "Interesting photo," Robert said, but his tone had changed somehow. There was something in his voice that Tom couldn't quite identify. "You worked at Ford?" "25 years, Tom replied. "Mostly on the line, but I got pulled into some special projects toward the end of my time there." Robert's eyes returned to the photograph, studying it with an intensity that made Tom slightly uncomfortable. "What kind of special projects?" Tom shrugged. "Oh, prototype work. Custom builds for executives, that sort of thing. Nothing too exciting." But Robert's expression suggested he found it very exciting indeed. He continued staring at the photo for several more seconds before finally turning away. "Well, we should probably get going. How much do we owe you for the repair?" Tom quoted his standard rate for the hose replacement, but Robert immediately pulled out a wallet that contained more cash than Tom typically saw in a week. "Please take this," he said, handing over bills that amounted to nearly 10 times the repair cost. "You've been incredibly kind to us tonight." "Sir, that's way too much," Tom protested. "The repair was only—" "Keep it," Robert insisted. "Consider it a thank you for the hospitality, the coffee, and the patience with our grandchildren. They'll be talking about this experience for months." Catherine stepped forward, and to Tom's surprise, gave him a warm hug. "Thank you for everything, Tom. You've restored our faith in the kindness of strangers." As the family prepared to leave, Sophie ran back to Tom one more time. "Mr. Tom, will you really teach my grandma about cars?" Tom smiled, ruffling her hair gently. "Anytime she wants to learn, sweetheart." After they'd driven away, their repaired sedan running smoothly into the night, Tom stood in his empty shop feeling strangely energized. It had been one of those encounters that reminded him why he'd chosen this path. The satisfaction of helping people, the joy of sharing knowledge, the simple pleasure of human connection. But as he locked up for the night, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there had been more to that encounter than met the eye. The way Robert had studied that photograph, the subtle questions about his Ford days, the generous payment that went far beyond gratitude for a simple repair. Something about the whole evening felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Over the next few days, Tom found himself thinking about the family more than he expected. He kept the business card Robert had given him, though when he'd looked at it later, he'd been surprised to find it contained only a phone number and an email address, with no company name or title. Most business cards told you something about the person. This one revealed nothing. A week passed, then 2, and Tom had almost convinced himself that the encounter was just one of those random acts of kindness that made life interesting. But then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Tom was replacing brake pads on a 2015 Honda when a black town car pulled into his lot. Not unusual in itself. He'd seen plenty of town cars over the years. But something about the way it moved, the deliberate pace, the tinted windows gave him pause. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, both carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. Tom wiped his hands on his coveralls and walked out to greet them, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Tom Sullivan?" the taller of the 2 men asked. "That's me. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather folder, flipping it open to reveal an identification badge. "I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. This is Agent Chen. We'd like to ask you a few questions about some recent contact you may have had with certain individuals." Tom's mind immediately jumped to the family from 2 weeks ago, though he couldn't understand why the FBI would be interested in a simple car repair. "Is this about the radiator hose? Because I can assure you the repair was done properly." Agent Martinez almost smiled. "No, Mr. Sullivan, this isn't about your mechanical work. We understand you recently provided assistance to a family, a man named Robert, his wife Catherine, and their grandchildren. Is that correct?" "Yes, but I don't understand. What did this man tell you about himself?" Agent Chen interrupted. Did he mention his work, his background, anything about his family's circumstances? Tom shook his head. Not really. They seemed like nice people who needed help with their car. We talked about Detroit, about my shop, about cars in general. Nothing that seemed important. The agents exchanged glances. Mr. Sullivan, Martinez continued, the man you helped that night wasn't just any stranded motorist. His real name is Robert Ashford, and he's been the subject of a federal investigation for the past 3 years. The name meant nothing to Tom, but the serious expressions on both agents' faces told him it should. I'm sorry, but I've never heard that name before. Robert Ashford is the former CEO of Ashford Industries, one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, Chen explained. 3 years ago, he disappeared along with approximately $2.8 billion in company funds. We've been tracking him ever since. Tom felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The kind, elderly man who'd helped his grandson with homework, who'd shown genuine interest in Tom's work, who'd paid generously for a simple repair. That man was a fugitive wanted for stealing nearly $3 billion? That's impossible, Tom said. He was with his family, his grandchildren. They were just traveling, trying to get to their hotel. Mr. Sullivan, Martinez said gently. Those weren't his grandchildren. We believe they were hired actors, part of an elaborate cover story designed to make him appear like an ordinary grandfather on a family trip. We think he was using the breakdown as an opportunity to test whether anyone in the area might recognize him. Tom's mind reeled. Every detail from that evening suddenly took on new significance. The expensive clothes, the casual display of wealth, the way Robert had studied that photograph from Tom's Ford days with such intensity. Had he been looking for something specific? Why are you telling me this? Tom asked. Because, Chen replied, we believe Robert Ashford chose your shop for a reason. Our investigation suggests he's been researching former Ford employees who worked on certain classified projects in the 1990s. Projects that might be relevant to his current situation. The special projects. Tom's stomach dropped as he remembered the prototype work, the custom builds, the vehicles that had rolled out of the Ford plant with VIN numbers that didn't match any production records. At the time, he'd assumed they were just executive toys, expensive playthings for company brass. But what if they'd been something more? Agent Martinez, Tom said slowly. What exactly was Robert Ashford accused of stealing? Not just money, Mr. Sullivan. Ashford Industries held contracts for developing next-generation automotive technology for military applications. Specifically, they were working on vehicles with advanced stealth capabilities, electromagnetic shielding, and communication systems that could operate independently of standard networks. Tom's blood ran cold. He remembered now the prototype project he'd worked on in 1998. They'd built exactly 12 vehicles, each one incorporating technology that seemed decades ahead of its time. He'd been told they were concept cars, demonstrations of what might be possible in the future. But the level of security around the project, the background checks, the non-disclosure agreements that had lasted long after his retirement, suddenly it all made sense. Mr. Sullivan? Chen's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you all right? Tom realized he'd been standing in silence for nearly a minute, processing the implications of what he'd just learned. The VIN, he said finally. I noticed the VIN on his car that night. I thought it looked familiar. Both agents immediately stepped closer. What about the VIN? Martinez asked urgently. It matched the format we used for the prototype vehicles I worked on at Ford. But that's impossible because those were all destroyed after the project ended. At least that's what we were told. The agents exchanged another look, this one filled with significance that Tom was only beginning to understand. Mr. Sullivan, Chen said carefully, we're going to need you to come with us. There are some people who need to hear this story, and there are some things about that project that you need to know. As Tom locked up his shop and climbed into the back of the government sedan, he couldn't help but think about that photograph on his wall, the one Robert Ashford had studied so intently. He'd been looking for something specific, and now Tom was starting to understand what it might have been. The ride to the federal building downtown passed in a blur of questions and half-formed answers. Tom learned that the prototype project he'd worked on hadn't been destroyed as promised. Instead, the vehicles had been moved to a secure facility, and eventually sold to private collectors and government agencies around the world. Each vehicle was worth millions of dollars, not just for its monetary value, but for the advanced technology it contained. More importantly, Tom learned that his name appeared on a very short list of people who possessed the specific knowledge needed to properly maintain and operate these vehicles. The maintenance protocols, the hidden features, the security systems, all of that information existed in the memories of the 12 Ford employees who had built them, and nowhere else. Robert Ashford has been systematically contacting everyone on that list, Martinez explained as they pulled into the federal building's parking garage. 3 of your former colleagues have disappeared over the past 2 years. 2 others have reported strange encounters with people claiming to need automotive assistance. Tom's mouth went dry. What happened to the people who disappeared? We don't know, Chen admitted. But we believe Ashford is trying to assemble a team capable of accessing and operating the prototype vehicles. If he succeeds, he'll have access to technology that could be sold to foreign governments for hundreds of millions of dollars. The next several hours passed in a conference room filled with people whose titles and agencies Tom couldn't keep straight. FBI agents, Defense Department officials, automotive engineers, and computer specialists, all of them focused on one question. What exactly had Robert Ashford learned during his visit to Tom's shop? Tom told the story again and again, trying to remember every detail, every question Ashford had asked, every moment when his attention had seemed particularly focused. The photograph on the wall became a central point of discussion. Had Ashford recognized someone in the picture? Had he been looking for confirmation that Tom was indeed who he claimed to be? The timing concerns us, said a woman who'd introduced herself as Director Williams from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Ashford disappeared 3 years ago with the money, but he's only recently begun contacting former Ford employees. Something has changed in his situation, something that's made this knowledge suddenly critical. A younger man with thick glasses and a laptop covered in security clearance stickers spoke up from the corner. We think he's found one of the vehicles. Our intelligence suggests that at least 3 of the original 12 are currently unaccounted for. If Ashford has acquired one, he'd need someone with your specific knowledge to fully activate its capabilities. Tom shook his head, trying to process everything he was hearing. But why approach me so openly? If he's really this dangerous fugitive, why not just grab me off the street? Because, Director Williams replied, he needed to verify that you were the right person, and he needed to assess whether you might be suspicious of his approach. The family scenario, the broken-down car, the generous payment, it was all designed to make you see him as a harmless, grateful stranger rather than a threat. Agent Martinez leaned forward across the table. Mr. Sullivan, we believe Ashford is planning to contact you again. When he does, we need you to be ready. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, ready? We want you to help us catch him, Chen said simply. You're one of the few people in the world who can give Ashford what he wants. That makes you incredibly valuable to him, and incredibly valuable to us. The plan they outlined was both simple and terrifying. Tom would return to his normal routine, but with constant surveillance and communication equipment that would alert the authorities the moment Ashford made contact. When that happened, Tom would play along, agreeing to help with whatever automotive problem Ashford presented, while secretly gathering intelligence about his location and plans. What if he realizes I'm working with you? Tom asked. What if he's not as harmless as he seemed that night? Director Williams's expression grew grim. Mr. Sullivan, a man doesn't steal $2.8 billion and disappear for 3 years by being harmless. Robert Ashford is extremely dangerous, and the technology he's pursuing could pose a significant threat to national security. But we believe that with proper preparation and support, we can apprehend him safely. As Tom drove home that evening, his head spinning with everything he'd learned, he couldn't help but think about the conversation he'd need to have with Maria. How do you explain to your wife that the nice elderly man you helped fix his car 2 weeks ago is actually a fugitive billionaire who might be planning to kidnap you? How do you describe a world where prototype cars contain technology worth more than entire city budgets? Maria listened to the entire story without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When Tom finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, processing what she'd heard. So let me understand this, she said finally. The government wants you to help catch a man who stole almost $3 billion, using knowledge from a secret project you worked on 25 years ago, involving cars that aren't supposed to exist. That's about the size of it, Tom admitted. Maria shook her head slowly. And I thought our biggest problem was the leaky roof in the garage. Despite everything, Tom found himself laughing. It was a sound that felt strange after the day he'd had, but it reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this woman nearly 3 decades ago. Maria had always been able to find perspective in even the most overwhelming situations. "Are you going to do it?" she asked. Tom looked around their modest living room, with its worn furniture and family photographs, and thought about the life they'd built together. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest and real and theirs. The idea of putting that at risk, of entering a world of fugitive billionaires and stolen technology, seemed almost absurd. But then he thought about the other Ford employees who had disappeared, about the technology that could fall into the wrong hands, about the fact that his knowledge might be the key to preventing something terrible from happening. "I think I have to," he said. Maria nodded, reaching over to take his hand. "Then we'll face it together." "But Tom?" "Yeah? Next time someone with an expensive car breaks down in our parking lot, maybe we should just call the RAA." 3 weeks passed without any contact from Robert Ashford. Tom returned to his normal routine, fixing cars and serving customers. But everything felt different now. The surveillance team was invisible but constant. He knew they were there, monitoring his shop, his home, his every movement. The communication device they'd given him looked like an ordinary smartphone, but could instantly connect him to a command center staffed 24 hours a day. He'd started to wonder if Ashford had somehow discovered the FBI's interest and decided to abandon whatever plan he'd been developing. But then, on a Thursday afternoon that had started like any other, everything changed again. Tom was working under the hood of a pickup truck when he heard the familiar sound of an expensive engine pulling into his lot. He looked up to see a silver Mercedes sedan, its paint job so perfect it seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. The driver who stepped out was a woman he'd never seen before. Tall, blonde, probably in her 40s, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Tom made in a month. "Excuse me," she called out as she approached the garage. "Are you Tom Sullivan?" Tom's heart immediately began racing. This wasn't Robert Ashford, but something about the woman's confident demeanor and the timing of her arrival set off every alarm bell in his head. He casually moved his hand toward the communication device in his pocket. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "My name is Linda Crawford," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I represent a private collector who's interested in acquiring your services for a very specific project." The code word they'd given him was collector. If anyone used that term in connection with automotive work, it was likely connected to Ashford and the prototype vehicles. Tom tried to keep his expression neutral, while his mind raced through the protocol he'd memorized. "What kind of project?" he asked. Linda smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The kind that pays very, very well. My employer has acquired a vintage vehicle that requires the attention of someone with your particular expertise. Someone who understands the unique requirements of certain Ford prototypes from the late 1990s. There it was. The confirmation that this was exactly what the FBI had been waiting for. Tom's hand found the panic button on his communication device, pressing it in a sequence that would alert the surveillance team without triggering any obvious response. "I work on a lot of cars," Tom said carefully. "What makes you think I'm the right person for your employer's project?" "Because," Linda replied, "Robert Ashford recommended you personally." The directness of her statement caught Tom off guard. He'd expected more subtlety, more of the elaborate charade that Ashford had used during his first visit. But Linda Crawford seemed to be dispensing with pretense entirely. "I'm not sure I know who that is," Tom lied. Linda's smile grew wider and significantly colder. "Mr. Sullivan, we both know that's not true. Mr. Ashford was very impressed with your professionalism during his recent visit. He believes you're exactly the person we need for this project." Tom glanced around his shop, noting the positions of the surveillance cameras the FBI had installed, trying to calculate how long it would take for backup to arrive. "What exactly does this project involve?" "Transportation," Linda said simply. "We need to move a very valuable vehicle from its current location to a new one. But this particular vehicle has certain security features that require specific knowledge to operate. knowledge that you possess. And if I'm not interested? Linda's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture that made Tom's skin crawl. Mr. Sullivan, I don't think you understand the scope of what we're offering. This project would pay enough for you to retire comfortably, to ensure your wife's medical bills are covered for life, to guarantee your children's financial security. Tom's blood ran cold. Linda Crawford knew about Maria's diabetes medication costs, about the college loans they were still paying off for their kids, about financial details that weren't public knowledge. This wasn't a casual recruitment attempt. They'd been researching him, studying him, preparing for this moment. How do you know about my family? He asked. We know everything about you, Tom, Linda replied. We know about your mortgage, your credit rating, your wife's prescription costs, your son's student loans. We know that you've been struggling to keep this shop profitable, that you've been considering bankruptcy, that you lie awake at night wondering how you're going to make everything work. The accuracy of her information was terrifying, but what scared Tom more was the implicit threat behind it. If they knew this much about his financial situation, they certainly knew where his family lived, where they worked, where they went to school. What if I refuse? He asked. Linda's smile disappeared entirely. That would be unfortunate, Tom. For everyone involved. Before Tom could respond, he heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into his parking lot with unusual speed. Through the windows, he could see black SUVs surrounding the building, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. Linda Crawford's head snapped toward the sound, her composed demeanor cracking for the first time since she'd arrived. What did you do? She demanded. What I had to do, Tom replied, backing away from her. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouted commands, drawn weapons, and tactical officers swarming through the shop. Linda Crawford was on the ground in handcuffs before she could reach the door, her perfect composure replaced by a stream of curses that would have made Tom's Marine Corps drill sergeant proud. Agent Martinez appeared at Tom's side, slightly out of breath but grinning with satisfaction. Nice work, Mr. Sullivan. That conversation gave us everything we needed. Is it over? Tom asked. Martinez's expression grew more serious. This was just the beginning. Crawford is a mid-level player, probably hired muscle with enough knowledge to make the initial contact. The real question is where Robert Ashford is, and whether he knows his recruitment attempt just failed. They got their answer 3 hours later, while Tom was giving his statement at the federal building downtown. Agent Chen burst into the conference room with a laptop and an expression of barely controlled panic. We've got a problem, he announced. A big one. On the laptop screen was a news feed from a financial network, showing a graph with numbers that seemed to be climbing impossibly fast. The headline read, Major cyber attack targets Federal Reserve Systems. What does this have to do with Ashford? Director Williams demanded. Chen pulled up another window, this one showing a map with multiple red dots scattered across the eastern United States. These are the locations where prototype vehicles have been detected in the past 6 hours. All of them are moving. All of them are heading toward Washington, D.C., and all of them are using the electromagnetic shielding technology that makes them nearly invisible to conventional tracking. Tom stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. How many vehicles are we talking about? At least 8, possibly more, Chen replied. We think Ashford has been planning this for years. The stolen money wasn't the real prize. It was funding for acquiring and modifying the prototype vehicles. He's assembled a fleet of nearly undetectable cars capable of penetrating security systems that were never designed to handle this level of technology. Director Williams was already on her phone, barking orders to someone higher up the chain of command. When she hung up, her face was grim. The president has been moved to a secure location. All major government buildings are going into lockdown. But if these vehicles can really do what we think they can do, traditional security measures may not be enough. Tom felt a sick understanding beginning to form in his mind. You want me to stop them? We want you to help us understand them, Martinez corrected. These vehicles have capabilities that aren't in any manual, features that exist only in the memories of the people who built them. If there's a way to disable them remotely, if there are hidden vulnerabilities we can exploit, you might be the only person who knows how to access them. The next 18 hours were unlike anything Tom had ever experienced. He found himself in a command center that looked like something from a science fiction movie, surrounded by computers, satellite feeds, and enough electronic equipment to power a small city. Military officers, intelligence analysts, and technical specialists worked around the clock to track Ashford's fleet and understand what he was planning. Tom's role was to serve as a living manual for technology he'd helped create but never fully understood. As reports came in about the vehicle's capabilities, their ability to jam communications, their resistance to electromagnetic pulses, their advanced navigation systems, he found himself remembering details from the original project that suddenly took on critical importance. "The power systems," he said during one briefing, studying satellite images of the vehicles in motion. "We built redundant power systems into each one, but there was a master override protocol. If you could access the primary control node, you could theoretically shut down the entire fleet at once." "Where is this control node?" asked a general whose uniform carried more ribbons than Tom could count. "That's the problem," Tom admitted. "It's not in a fixed location. The control node was designed to be mobile, probably installed in whichever vehicle serves as the command unit for the operation. So we need to identify the lead vehicle and get close enough to access its systems," Director Williams summarized. "How close?" Tom tried to remember the specifications from 25 years ago. Physical contact. The override protocol required a direct connection to prevent remote hijacking. You'd need someone who knows the access codes to actually touch the vehicle. The room fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. Getting close enough to physically access one of the vehicles would mean infiltrating whatever location Ashford had chosen for his operation, bypassing security systems that had been designed using stolen military technology, and somehow connecting to a computer system that would be heavily protected. "It's a suicide mission," someone muttered from the back of the room. "Maybe," Director Williams said, "or maybe it's the only way to prevent something much worse." As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the scale of Ashford's plan began to become clear. The cyber attack on financial systems had been a diversion, designed to draw attention and resources away from his real target. Intelligence reports suggested that the fleet of prototype vehicles was converging on a specific location in downtown D.C., but their electromagnetic shielding made it impossible to determine exactly where they were or what they were planning. "Sir?" a young analyst called out from her workstation. "We're getting reports of unusual activity around the Smithsonian. Multiple witnesses describe seeing vehicles that seem to shimmer or become partially invisible." Tom's heart sank. The Smithsonian complex housed some of the most sensitive research facilities in the country, including classified projects that were never meant to be public knowledge. If Ashford was targeting the Smithsonian, he wasn't just planning a robbery. He was going after information and technology that could reshape the balance of global power. "What's housed in the restricted sections of the Smithsonian?" Tom asked. Director Williams pulled up a classified manifest on her secure tablet. "Advanced materials research, prototype weapon systems, and..." She paused, her face growing pale. "The complete archives of the Ford prototype project, including detailed schematics and operational manuals for all 12 vehicles." Tom felt the pieces clicking into place with terrifying clarity. He doesn't just want to use the vehicles, he wants to manufacture more of them. With those archives, he could build an entire army of undetectable cars. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as the full scope of the threat became apparent. Phone calls were made to the highest levels of government. Military units were deployed throughout the capital, and emergency protocols that had been theoretical exercises just hours before suddenly became urgent reality. "Mr. Sullivan," Director Williams said, pulling Tom aside as the activity swirled around them. "We need you to understand something. The technology you helped create 25 years ago wasn't just advanced for its time. It was decades ahead of anything that existed. Even today, most of our defensive systems can't reliably detect or stop these vehicles." Tom nodded grimly. "What do you need me to do?" "We're going to get you as close to that command vehicle as possible. You'll have one chance to access the override system and shut down the entire fleet." "But Tom..." She paused, clearly struggling with what she needed to say next. "The chances of getting you out alive are not good." Tom thought about Maria, probably sitting in their kitchen at this very moment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the newspaper, completely unaware that her husband was about to risk everything to stop a threat she couldn't even imagine. He thought about their children, about the life they'd built together, about the simple satisfaction of fixing broken things and helping people who needed it. "If I don't do this," he said quietly, "how many people could die?" Director Williams didn't answer immediately, but her silence was answer enough. "Then we'd better get started," Tom said. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Tom would be inserted into downtown DC using conventional transportation, then make his way on foot to the Smithsonian complex. Once there, he would have to identify the command vehicle, approach it without being detected, and physically connect a specialized device to its control systems. The device itself was a marvel of engineering, developed in the few hours since they'd learned about the override protocol. It contained the access codes Tom remembered from the original project, along with additional software designed to exploit vulnerabilities in the vehicle's security systems. "Remember," said the tech specialist who'd built the device, "you need to maintain physical contact for at least 30 seconds while the override executes. If you disconnect too early, the system will reset and lock you out permanently." 30 seconds didn't sound like much time, until Tom considered that he'd be spending it completely exposed while surrounded by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill for this technology. As the helicopter carried him toward his insertion point, Tom found himself thinking about the photograph on his office wall, the one that had started this entire chain of events. In that picture, he'd been young and proud, part of a team creating something they believed would make the world safer. Now, decades later, he was risking his life to prevent that same technology from falling into the wrong hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. The skills that had made him valuable to Robert Ashford, his knowledge of the prototype vehicles, his understanding of their hidden capabilities, were the same skills that made him the only person who could stop Ashford's plan. The helicopter set him down 6 blocks from the Smithsonian, in a parking lot that had been evacuated under the pretext of a gas leak. Tom checked his equipment one final time. The override device, a radio that would work despite the electromagnetic interference, and a small camera that would transmit everything he saw back to the command center. "Tom," Director Williams's voice crackled through his earpiece, "we're showing 8 vehicles converged on the Museum of Natural History. They've disabled the security systems and are moving toward the classified research levels." Tom started walking, trying to look like just another morning commuter as he made his way through the increasingly empty streets. The closer he got to the Smithsonian, the more obvious it became that something extraordinary was happening. Police barriers blocked most of the surrounding streets, but they were unmanned. The officers had been quietly relocated to prevent civilian casualties. "Visual contact," Tom whispered into his radio as he rounded the corner and saw the museum complex ahead. At first glance, everything looked normal. Tourists were still walking around the public areas, unaware that anything was wrong. But Tom's trained eye caught the details that others missed. The subtle shimmer of electromagnetic fields, the way certain shadows seemed to move independently of their objects, the faint distortion that indicated vehicles operating under stealth technology. "I count at least 6 vehicles," he reported. "They're positioned around the building's perimeter, probably as security while the others are inside. Tom, we need you to identify the command vehicle. Look for one that's positioned to coordinate with the others, probably with enhanced communication arrays." Tom studied the barely visible distortions, trying to remember the specific modifications that would distinguish a command unit from the standard vehicles. After several minutes of careful observation, he spotted what he was looking for: a subtle difference in the electromagnetic signature, indicating additional equipment that wasn't part of the original design. "Found it," he whispered. "Northeast corner, positioned behind the service entrance. It's got extra hardware that wasn't in the original specs." "How are you going to get close enough?" Director Williams asked. Tom studied the building's layout, noting the security cameras, the patrol patterns of the few remaining guards, and the positioning of the other vehicles. The command unit was well protected, but there was a blind spot near the loading dock where delivery trucks normally unloaded supplies. "Service tunnel," he said finally. "There's a maintenance tunnel that runs under the loading area. If I can access it from the street side, I should be able to come up directly underneath the vehicle." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Tom's life. The maintenance tunnel was cramped, dark, and filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, and Tom found himself holding his breath whenever he heard voices or footsteps from above. When he finally reached the access point beneath the loading dock, Tom could hear the subtle hum of the command vehicle's systems directly overhead. According to his equipment, the electromagnetic shielding was active, which meant the vehicle was essentially invisible to most detection methods, but also meant its crew might be less vigilant about conventional threats. Tom slowly lifted the access cover, peering out into the loading area. The command vehicle sat exactly where he'd expected, its distorted outline barely visible even from this close distance. Two figures in dark clothing stood near what appeared to be the vehicle's rear, their attention focused on handheld devices that probably showed the status of the overall operation. This was it, the moment everything came down to. Tom checked the override device one more time, making sure the connection cable was ready and the activation sequence was properly programmed. Then, moving as quietly as he could manage, he crawled out of the tunnel and began approaching the vehicle. The electromagnetic field made it difficult to judge exact distances, but Tom could feel the static electricity building in the air as he got closer. The two guards were still focused on their equipment, speaking in low voices about something Tom couldn't quite hear. He was within 3 feet of the vehicle when one of the guards looked up. For a split second, Tom thought he'd been spotted, but the guard's eyes seemed to look right through him, scanning the area without focusing on any specific threat. The electromagnetic distortion was working in Tom's favor, making him as difficult to see as the vehicle itself. Tom reached out slowly, his hand extending toward what his eyes told him was empty air, but his other senses insisted was solid metal. When his fingers finally made contact with the vehicle's surface, he felt a slight shock as the static electricity discharged through his body. Now came the critical part. Tom carefully positioned the override device against what he hoped was the correct access panel, based on his 25-year-old memories of where such panels had been located on the prototype vehicles. The device's magnetic clamps engaged with a soft click that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet loading area. "Connection established," he whispered into his radio. Initiating override sequence. The device began its work, cycling through access codes and exploiting the vulnerabilities that Tom and his team had inadvertently built into the vehicles decades earlier. A small display showed the progress: 10%, 20%, 30%. "What's that?" one of the guards said suddenly. Tom froze, certain he'd been discovered. But the guard was pointing toward the building where alarms had begun sounding in the distance. "Probably just the museum's security system reacting to our presence," the other guard replied. "Nothing to worry about." The override device continued its work. 50%, 60%, 70%. "Tom," Director Williams' voice crackled through his earpiece. "We're showing massive data transfer from the museum's classified levels. Ashford's people are downloading the prototype archives. You need to speed this up." "I can't make it go faster," Tom whispered back. "The safety protocols are built into the system. 80%, 85%, 90%. "Hey," one of the guards said, his voice much closer now. "Do you see that shimmer over there, near the loading dock?" Tom's heart stopped. The guard was looking directly at him, though his expression suggested he wasn't quite sure what he was seeing. 95%, 98%, 99%. "Check it out," the first guard told his partner. "Could be a reflection, but we can't be too careful." Tom watched in horror as both guards began walking toward his position, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. The override device was so close to completion, but 30 seconds had never felt so long. 100%. Override complete. The effect was immediate and dramatic. All around the museum complex, the electromagnetic distortions suddenly vanished as the prototype vehicles lost power and became fully visible. Tom found himself crouched next to a sleek black sedan that had appeared out of nowhere, while similar vehicles materialized throughout the area. The guards spun around in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened to their invisible fleet. In that moment of distraction, Tom pulled the override device free and rolled away from the command vehicle, seeking cover behind a concrete barrier. "All vehicles disabled," he reported into his radio. Repeat, all vehicles disabled. The response was immediate. FBI tactical teams that had been waiting just outside the area suddenly converged on the museum from all directions. The guards who had nearly discovered Tom found themselves surrounded within seconds, their advanced technology useless now that their vehicles had been neutralized. But Tom's mission wasn't over yet. Inside the museum, Robert Ashford and his team were still downloading the prototype archives, information that could be used to build new vehicles, even without the original fleet. The only way to stop them was to shut down the data transfer from inside the building. "Tom, we need you to get to the classified levels," Director Williams instructed. "The download is happening from a terminal in the basement research facility. Can you access that area?" Tom looked at the museum building, noting the emergency exits and service entrances that might provide a way inside. "I can try. What am I looking for?" "A computer terminal connected to the archive servers. If you can physically disconnect it or initiate an emergency wipe protocol, we can prevent the download from completing." Tom made his way toward the building, using the chaos of the tactical operation as cover. FBI agents were systematically clearing each level, but the museum was enormous and the process was taking time. If Ashford had chosen his timing well, he might be able to complete the download and escape before the authorities reached him. The service entrance Tom chose led directly to the building's lower levels, bypassing the public areas where tourists were being evacuated. The corridors here were utilitarian and maze-like, designed for staff and researchers rather than visitors. Tom followed the signs toward the research facilities, hoping his basic understanding of the building's layout would be sufficient. He found the classified research area behind a series of security doors that had been forced open, probably by Ashford's team during their initial breach. The corridor beyond was eerily quiet, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows on the walls. Tom moved carefully, knowing that Ashford's people were somewhere ahead of him, and probably armed. The sound of computer fans and cooling systems grew louder as he approached what appeared to be the main server room. Through a partially open door, Tom could see banks of computer equipment and multiple workstations. At one of the terminals, a figure in dark clothing was hunched over a keyboard, monitoring what appeared to be a massive data transfer operation. Tom recognized the man immediately, despite the 3 weeks that had passed since their first encounter. Robert Ashford looked older and more tired than he had that night in the auto shop. But there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes as he watched terabytes of classified information flow from government servers to portable storage devices. 78% complete, Ashford muttered to someone Tom couldn't see. "Another 10 minutes and we'll have everything we need." Tom slowly pulled out his radio, preparing to report Ashford's location to the tactical teams. But before he could speak, a hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. "Well, well," said a familiar voice. Tom Sullivan, the helpful mechanic. Tom found himself face to face with Linda Crawford, the woman who had been arrested at his shop just days earlier. She was pointing a pistol at his chest, her expression cold and professional. "I thought you were in federal custody," Tom said. "Bail is a wonderful thing when you have the right connections," Linda replied. "Now drop the radio and step into the server room. Mr. Ashford would like to thank you personally for your assistance." Tom had no choice but to comply. As he entered the server room, Robert Ashford looked up from his computer terminal with an expression that mixed satisfaction with disappointment. "Tom," Ashford said, his voice carrying the same warm tone he'd used that night in the shop. "I had hoped we could work together on this project. You've always struck me as a practical man who understands the value of opportunity." "Stealing classified technology isn't an opportunity," Tom replied. "It's treason." Ashford laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Treason? Tom, I helped develop half of this technology in the first place. My company built the systems that the government is now trying to keep secret. All I'm doing is reclaiming what rightfully belongs to me. And the $8 billion you stole? That belongs to you too? That money was compensation for years of government contracts that were canceled without cause. Projects that were terminated when they became inconvenient for certain political interests." Ashford's voice grew harder. "I spent decades building technology that could have revolutionized transportation, communication, and defense. Instead, it was buried in classified archives and forgotten." Tom looked around the server room, noting the progress bars on multiple computer screens showing the ongoing data transfer. "So you decided to steal it back and sell it to the highest bidder?" "I decided to ensure that this technology reaches its full potential," Ashford corrected. "There are governments and organizations around the world who would pay handsomely for vehicles that can operate undetected, for communication systems that can't be intercepted, for defensive capabilities that render conventional weapons useless." 85% complete, Linda Crawford reported from her position near the door. "But we're running out of time. The tactical teams are on the 4th level and moving fast." Ashford nodded, then turned back to Tom. "I'm going to give you one last chance, Tom. Help me complete this transfer and I'll make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams. Refuse, and..." He gestured toward Linda's weapon. Tom thought about Maria, about their modest life together, about the simple satisfaction of honest work and helping people who needed it. Then he thought about the technology that was being stolen, about the ways it could be used by hostile governments or terrorist organizations, about the responsibility he felt for having helped create it in the first place. "I can't do that," Tom said quietly. Ashford's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that suggested he'd expected this answer. "I'm sorry to hear that, Tom. You're a good man. But sometimes good men make poor business decisions." Linda Crawford raised her weapon, preparing to end the confrontation with the same cold efficiency she'd shown throughout the operation. But before she could fire, the server room's lights went out completely, plunging the area into total darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in a red glow that made the computer screens seem to float in space. In the confusion, Tom heard footsteps, shouted commands, and the distinctive sound of tactical gear moving through the corridors. "Download interrupted," someone called out from near the computers. "We're losing the connection." Tom realized that the power outage had disrupted the data transfer, probably as part of the FBI's plan to prevent the theft from being completed. But in the darkness and confusion, he'd also lost track of both Ashford and Crawford. "Federal agents," a voice boomed from the corridor. "This area is surrounded. Exit with your hands visible." Tom called out his own location, identifying himself as the cooperative civilian who was supposed to be in the building. Within moments, tactical officers had secured the server room and were checking each workstation to assess how much data had been successfully transferred. "Looks like they got about 87%, one of the technical specialists reported. "Significant, but not complete. We might be able to determine what's missing and take steps to protect those specific systems." But Robert Ashford and Linda Crawford were nowhere to be found. A thorough search of the building revealed that they had escaped during the power outage, probably using service tunnels or emergency exits that the tactical teams hadn't yet secured. "They got away," Tom said, feeling a mixture of relief and disappointment. "For now," Agent Martinez replied. "But we've captured most of their team, disabled their entire vehicle fleet, and prevented them from stealing complete copies of the prototype archives. This operation is a major setback for whatever larger plan they had in mind." As Tom was escorted out of the museum, he could see the full scope of the law enforcement response. The entire museum complex was surrounded by federal agents, the streets were blocked by emergency vehicles, and helicopters circled overhead with searchlights sweeping the surrounding area. "Mr. Sullivan," Director Williams approached him as they reached the command post that had been set up in the museum's parking lot. "What you did today may have prevented one of the largest technology thefts in American history. The country owes you a debt of gratitude." Tom looked around at the controlled chaos surrounding them, thinking about how far he'd traveled from the simple life of fixing cars and helping neighbors. "I just want to go home to my wife." "Of course," Director Williams said. "But first, there are some people who want to thank you personally." The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefings, congratulations, and meetings with officials whose names and titles Tom immediately forgot. Everyone seemed eager to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to assure him that his actions had made a real difference. But all Tom could think about was getting back to his shop, back to his normal life, back to the simple satisfaction of honest work and helping people who needed it. The helicopter ride home gave him time to process everything that had happened. In the span of just a few weeks, he'd gone from being an ordinary small business owner to playing a central role in preventing a major national security threat. The knowledge that he'd helped create the technology being stolen, and that his unique expertise had been essential to stopping the theft, left him with a complex mixture of pride and responsibility. When the helicopter finally set him down in the parking lot of Sullivan's auto repair, Tom felt like he was returning to a different world. The shop looked exactly the same. The peeling paint, the worn sign, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. But everything felt different now. Maria was waiting for him inside, her eyes red from crying but her smile bright with relief. "Is it over?" she asked as she wrapped her arms around him. "It's over," Tom confirmed, holding her close and breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the coffee she'd been drinking while she waited. "Good," Maria said, "because I've been thinking about what you said, about that woman wanting to learn basic car maintenance. I'd like to take you up on that offer." Tom laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet shop. "You want to learn about cars?" "I want to learn about everything," Maria replied. "This whole experience has made me realize how much I don't know about the work you do, about the knowledge you carry, about the ways you help people. If my husband is going to be some kind of secret agent mechanic, I want to understand what that means." "I'm not a secret agent," Tom protested. "I'm just a guy who knows how to fix things." Maria pulled back to look at him, her expression serious but warm. "Tom Sullivan, you're a man who helped save his country using knowledge from a job he worked 25 years ago. You're a man who risked his life to prevent dangerous technology from falling into the wrong hands. You're a lot more than just a guy who fixes things." Over the following weeks, as Tom gradually returned to his normal routine, he found that Maria was right. Word of his involvement in the Smithsonian incident had somehow leaked, despite government efforts to keep the details classified. Customers began treating him differently, with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made him uncomfortable. The local newspaper ran a story about the hometown hero who had helped federal agents prevent a major security breach, though most of the specific details were omitted for national security reasons. Tom found himself fielding questions from reporters, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at community events. But the most significant change came in the form of a phone call from Director Williams, 3 weeks after the incident at the museum. "Tom," she said, "we have a proposition for you. The government is establishing a new consulting program for situations involving older technologies that require specialized knowledge. We'd like you to be one of our primary consultants." "What would that involve?" Tom asked. "Mostly it would be advisory work, reviewing technical documents, providing historical context for investigations, that sort of thing. You'd maintain your normal business and life, but you'd be available when we need someone with your particular expertise." Tom thought about it for several days before giving his answer. The idea of staying connected to this world of high-stakes technology and national security had a certain appeal, but he also valued the simple life he'd built in his small auto shop. "I'll do it," he finally told Director Williams, "but with conditions. My shop comes first, my family comes first, and I won't travel more than necessary. I'm a mechanic, not a spy." "Understood," Director Williams replied. "We're not looking for James Bond, Tom. We're looking for someone who understands how things work and isn't afraid to get his hands dirty when it matters." As for Robert Ashford and Linda Crawford, they remained at large despite an international manhunt that involved law enforcement agencies on 3 continents. Intelligence reports suggested they had fled to a country without extradition treaties, where they were probably working to sell whatever partial information they had managed to steal from the Smithsonian archives. "Do you think they'll try again?" Maria asked one evening as they sat in their living room, watching the news coverage of yet another government security briefing about cyber threats and advanced technology theft. "Probably," Tom admitted, "but next time we'll be ready for them." Maria smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "We? Okay. They'll be ready for them," Tom corrected. "I'll just be here in the shop, fixing cars and maybe teaching you how to change your own oil." "I'd like that," Maria said, "but Tom..." "Yeah?" "If they ever need you again, if there's another situation where your knowledge could make a difference, I want you to help them. What you did was important, and I'm proud of you for doing it." Tom squeezed her hand, thinking about the photograph on his office wall, about the young man who had helped build something extraordinary without understanding its full implications, and about the older man who had risked everything to prevent that technology from being misused. "I hope it never comes to that," he said, "but if it does, at least now I know I can handle it." 6 months later, Tom was working under the hood of a 2018 Camry when he heard a familiar sound, the rumble of an expensive engine pulling into his lot. He looked up to see a silver Bentley sedan, its paint job pristine, and its windows tinted dark enough to hide the occupants. For a moment, Tom's heart rate spiked as he remembered the last time an expensive car had brought unexpected visitors to his shop. But then the driver's door opened and out stepped a woman in her 40s wearing a simple business suit and a genuine smile. "Mr. Sullivan?" she called out as she approached. "My name is Sarah Chen, and I represent a technology company that's very interested in your expertise." Tom wiped his hands on his coveralls, noting that this woman's approach was completely different from Linda Crawford's aggressive recruitment tactics. "What kind of technology company?" "The kind that builds things to help people," Sarah replied. "We're developing new automotive safety systems, and we could use someone with your background to help us avoid some of the pitfalls that earlier projects encountered." Tom studied her expression, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. But Sarah Chen seemed genuinely enthusiastic about her work, and her company's focus on safety, rather than military applications, appealed to him. "Tell me more," Tom said. As Sarah outlined her company's projects, collision avoidance systems, emergency response technologies, and communication tools designed to save lives rather than hide them, Tom found himself thinking about the different paths that technology could take. The same knowledge that had been used to create nearly invisible military vehicles could also be applied to making cars safer, more efficient, and more responsive to their drivers' needs. "We're not looking for someone to build weapons or spy gadgets," Sarah concluded. "We're looking for someone who understands that the best technology is the kind that makes ordinary people's lives better." Tom looked around his shop, at the honest work that filled his days, at the customers who trusted him to keep their vehicles running safely. Then he thought about the responsibility that came with specialized knowledge, about the opportunity to help ensure that future innovations served the right purposes. "When do we start?" he asked. And so Tom Sullivan, the small-town mechanic who had helped prevent a billion-dollar technology theft, found himself embarking on a new chapter of his life. It was a chapter that would involve working with some of the brightest minds in automotive technology, contributing to innovations that would eventually save thousands of lives, and helping to ensure that the lessons learned from the prototype vehicle project would guide future developments in positive directions. But through it all, he remained what he had always been, a man who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars or technological capabilities. The real treasure wasn't the billion-dollar secret he had helped protect, but the relationships, the purpose, and the simple satisfaction of work well done that had sustained him throughout his journey. As Tom often told the audiences at the occasional speaking engagements he now accepted, sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with the most ordinary acts of kindness. You never know when helping a stranger might change your life, or when the skills you've developed in everyday work might be exactly what the world needs to solve its biggest problems. The story of the mechanic who discovered a billion-dollar secret had become something larger than the sum of its parts. A reminder that heroism often comes from unexpected places, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, and that sometimes the greatest rewards come not from what we gain, but from what we choose to protect. If this story inspired you to believe in the power of ordinary kindness and extraordinary courage, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories of everyday heroes who changed the world. And remember, you never know when your own skills and compassion might be exactly what someone else needs to overcome the impossible.